Russia's war on Ukraine has lasted over 33 months, and today we'll examine the military situation. I'm Julian Röbke, and this is BILD Situation Room. We are starting off with some truly unique and exclusive footage from Western Russia. This footage comes specifically from the city of Kursk, which serves as the capital of this notable and intriguing Russian region. We witnessed the first Ukrainian ATACMS strike last night on an Air Force base in Russia, specifically on the old Kursk airport, which was used for civilian purposes until 2021. Since then, though, it's been for military use only. And now we see footage here taken by passers-by, specifically residents in Kursk, which is quite interesting because they show us that once again Russia has spread a lot of propaganda, but what is true in this case is the Ukrainian, at least the unofficial Ukrainian version. As the Ukrainian government doesn't comment on such attacks, they clearly made a direct hit, even several. We can see here a missile, initially ascending on the left side of the image. Now we can see it ascending into the air and gradually disappearing into the sky above. That was an anti-aircraft missile launched from Kursk airport. We now know that an S-400 missile system was stationed here. This has been confirmed by both Russian war bloggers and Ukrainians. The Russians, however, claim that with this advanced S-400 system, specifically the S-400 Triumph, which is the most modern missile defense system Russia possesses, in service only since the year 2007, they have reportedly managed to destroy 7 out of 8 incoming ATACMS missiles quite effectively. However, what we observe now is the actual reality. We just witnessed the rocket launching into the air and are currently seeing the initial impacts of the ATACMS missiles all around the area. I'll try to highlight this a bit so we can see it even better. We can clearly see these two streaks ascending into the sky. Those are the two rockets that were just launched a short while ago. The first wasn't on video, but the second was. However, these exhaust trails show that 2 rockets were indeed launched there, and we can see that right where this launch took place on the Russian side at the airport now. These explosions here are visible on the ground, and that happens to be one of the ATACMS M39A1 missiles, which encompasses a total of 300 M74 bomb clusters. They're like small grenades that are now raining down on that S-400 artillery piece. That means we observe that in reality the Russians were the ones who fired first, with at least 2 missiles being launched into the night sky over the region of Kursk. However, we see the impact directly at this position right afterwards. That means it is extremely unlikely that the Russians would have shot down or damaged the missiles, and yet they would hit exactly where they are supposed to. That means it's much more likely, and we'll just let it run now, that we have the first impact here now, there on the left in front. I hope you can see it. The second impact. Further back on the left-hand side, the third, fourth, and additionally the 5th impact. A total of 5 different times we observe the detonation of 300 M74 bomblets occurring around the airport, and this very much indicates that substantial and severe destruction was caused in that area. I'll run it again, so not only that this S-400 system was hit there, but we have the latest footage, satellite images from the end of September this year. And in these images, we can clearly see that a total of 8 Su-25 ground attack aircraft and 6 Mi-24 ground attack helicopters had indeed been stationed here at the Kursk airport. That means these are not strategic aviation aircraft, so no large bombers. There are not any of those either, like the Su-34 and other aircraft which drop these glide bombs or the precision bombs that have become common nowadays. But it's precisely the aircraft that are being deployed in Kursk, Sumy and Kharkiv, specifically in the vicinity, to support their own troops on the ground there. We now have more footage of a soldier or maybe a construction worker, though it's not completely clear, who was right there at the airport and filmed the whole thing. Also here we see again from another perspective, which also verifies what we just saw, these 2 streaks that ascend into the air here. That's the S-400 system that was fired there at the airport. And we can immediately observe, if I briefly wind this footage back a little, that right around these 2 distinct stripes encircling the gun emplacement itself, the impacts are now entirely unmistakable here. And they're getting dangerously close. That was the first one right behind, and the second. It's a bit closer now. We can see that they missed here, so just barely this vehicle right near the soldier or construction worker or whatever that is. That means we can clearly see that the people the Russians have spread this information to are speaking nonsense. And the reality is, just to see here once again, here are the 2 stripes going up, already around the first explosions, only a few of which were recorded here, and immediately after that, the next 300 bomblets explode really close to this small bus here, and the driver was fortunate in this instance that he Nobody was harmed here. And what's particularly interesting is this is already the second confirmed incident involving S-400 or Ukrainian ATACMS missiles from the USA targeting an S-400 battery located in Kursk. We've received confirmation from the Russian side since this morning that close to Kursk, near the city, in a village 2 days ago, so specifically on the 23rd. Or actually 3 days ago, on November 23rd, yet another S-400 missile launcher was successfully hit. And in that location, reports indicate that 5 Russian soldiers were reportedly killed in the radar unit when the ATACMS accurately targeted and hit the system. The names are also known, the photos are known. This means the Russians confirm once again that the Ukrainians, since the approval about 2 weeks ago, are using ATACMS against Russian targets in Russia, that the Ukrainians are making use of them nearly every single day, typically targeting high-value objectives every 2 to 3 days. We also have information from the US side, which has now been confirmed by the White House, that they help with target selection. That means you can definitely identify a high-value target and say it's worth deploying the ATACMS there. And that's exactly what Ukraine is doing, once again very close to their own country, meaning only for defense purposes, not deep inside Russia, although that would also be a form of defense, if one were to attack Ingal's airbase or similar in Saratov. However, the attacks we have had so far have been right here, near Kursk, right next to Ukraine. We can observe this small section here, which is still being held by Ukraine. However, this larger section extends right next to it and is, of course, a significant, yes, it serves as the crucial logistical support for Russia to mount attacks there in Kharkiv and to reclaim these regions in Sumy. This implies that all of these are indeed very close targets, at least when considered relatively, around Ukraine, where you can effectively utilize these M39A1 missiles with their maximum range of 165 to 300 kilometers. Thus, indeed, right near to Ukraine. That wraps up our point on Kursk, specifically meaning Kursk city here. Now, we shift focus to eastern Ukraine to evaluate the ongoing situation in the Donetsk region, particularly concentrating on what's happening in Kurakova. And unfortunately, there are very poor recordings for the Ukrainian army. They show that the Russian army has managed to advance into the center of Kurakova. We see these images now for the first time, which we sadly know from many other cities. We are observing the large buildings downtown. We notice smoke present, and by focusing on that entrance below, we will indeed see Russian soldiers who come and go here, conducting combat operations in the center of Kurakova, this former town of 18,000 residents, which has been successfully for months now. Now we see it, there they enter the Russian soldiers who were defended off successfully for months. Now, the Russians are very proud that they managed to advance to the center, albeit with a small unit. Now, there are 2 possibilities that could potentially happen. We just observed one particular case in Kupiansk. The Ukrainians managed to defeat the Russians here and completely drive them out again. That's an isolated incident that we witnessed in the city of Kupiansk. It is considerably more probable, or unfortunately at least statistically more plausible. When you look at the past few months, the Russians can bring in reinforcements here, so they can advance into the city center with more and more soldiers, and thus manage to accomplish it accordingly, to gain a foothold here and gradually drive out the Ukrainians. We can now see the Russian drone here. Pulls out a bit. That means we're seeing here, this is really a major main street in the middle of the city, which is being displayed here. And this is quite tragic for the Ukrainians, who had tirelessly tried for months on end to hold and defend this particular area. Let's take a look at the map, where initially it's simply a small line. I hope you can even recognize it, since our map provider, Deep State Map, has also marked it there. That means even in Ukraine they notice that this city has been entered, and perhaps you can in fact see it right here. This small orange line unmistakably indicates that the Russians have now advanced into the central area. Somehow they managed to do it. Apparently it's just a small sabotage unit, but it resulted in intense and heavy fighting. We've just seen that with vehicles, also with a lot of smoke from artillery and so on, which managed to advance here in the center. And we want to head a bit from Kharkov northwards to thoroughly examine the situation in Sonzivka, because there it at least appears that the Ukrainians are persistently holding their resistance within the city. As if the city, just as it's clearly marked on the map here, is not yet completely under Russian control, but rather it seems as though Ukrainian ground forces are persistently active in the area. We see here these relatively new footage of a T-64 tank from the Ukrainian army, which just drives into Sonzivka, making its way from the outer districts towards the very heart of the city, arriving shortly at the center and then proceeding to open fire on this well-known museum, a significant and historical cultural museum. What was built there, what the culture in Donetsk was actually supposed to showcase. This is the biggest building here in the center. We know that the Russians have been sitting there for about 3 weeks now, meaning they have control over it. And now we see the tank opening fire, and of course the whole thing is a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, of course, it is dangerous for the Russian soldiers who are there when a tank fires at them from close range. It seems the Russian soldiers can't use anti-tank weapons to defend themselves here. Thirdly, we also see that this tank once again comes without infantry. That means Ukraine appears here as well, having far too few men, no way to strike back on the ground, but they are taking a heavy weapon system alone. Repeatedly let them drive in, allegedly kill some Russians here, and then quickly drive out again, leaving the surviving Russians here in the town. And this naturally poses the great risk that more and more soldiers are reinforced, making it increasingly difficult for the tank because, over time, weapon systems, shoulder-launched anti-tank weapons, for example, bazookas, or even that the armored mechanized units of the Russians are being pursued. This is a strategy that we've seen often, which is due to the fact that Ukraine has too few men, too few soldiers, or at least doesn't want to sacrifice its soldiers for close combat, man against man, in cities, which leads to heavy tanks being deployed in their place instead. We will stay with yet another video in the Kurakova region. Let's take a closer look at another attack, specifically one carried out by the Ukrainian Air Force. You might see this here. This is the prison of the Kurakova metropolitan area. We can observe this with the double walls that extend all around the perimeter of this prison. This is one of the facilities that the Russians were able to capture in the last few weeks. Probably no passengers were there anymore. They were probably taken out. Nonetheless, we can quite clearly observe once more that the Russians, along with these kinds of structures, the strong and well-established ones, when they were able to capture them without the Ukrainians forcing the Russians to destroy them because they stayed inside, then the Russians use these fortified structures, in this case a prison, which is naturally considered extremely resilient, and they settle there, and then the Ukrainians, as seen in this video, have to deploy there, in this case a JDAM-ER, employ a precision-guided bomb from the United States to sufficiently destroy your own infrastructure as you have withdrawn more swiftly, when the Russians were able to destroy it, so to speak. And because now one is either in the position or forced to be in the position where one has to attack their own established structures, since Russians took them over. So much for discussing the topic of Kurakova and the surrounding greater Kurakova area. We now intend to move a bit further to the area of Velika Novosilka. And Velika Novosilka is a town where, in the last 7 days, just under 7 days, the Russians have launched a surprise offensive, where they have taken more than 70 square kilometers. And here we have 2 videos that show how the once relatively large distance from Velika Novosilka to the front, namely more than 8 or 9 kilometers, has significantly shrunk, which leads to 2 things. Firstly, we can see here that Russia is now able to use FPV drones to target Ukrainian soldiers, presumably soldiers, in this case civilian vehicles, to hit within the city. This is of course a major issue for Ukrainians. Here we see on the left the tall buildings in Velika Novosilka. That means we are actually within the city here. Here is the Ukrainian vehicle that is moving over there, and because the Russians have gotten so close, they now have the range, which is only about 5 to 10 kilometers maximum, of their FPV drones to pursue Ukraine within the urban area, which naturally turns the city into a really extremely dangerous zone for the Ukrainian military forces. We observe vehicles under attack repeatedly. We also notice the large buildings, and this all occurs because the Russians are now so incredibly close. Again, on the right side, we see a larger building within the city and a parked vehicle, a bus, which is being attacked by the Russian army here. Communication systems are also hit. These antennas are crucial, for example, to control Ukrainian FPV drones. The Russians are currently positioned near Velika Novosilka and are actively attacking the Ukrainian structure situated there. However, with the Russians getting so close to the city, the Ukrainians can of course now use their kamikaze drones or their various other drones. And a group of the Ukrainian army is now deploying a drone here for the first time, which we have seen in testing before, but haven't yet seen in action. And this is actually a small drone. You can't really refer to it as a kamikaze drone, but rather a combat drone. Essentially, it's a quadcopter with an AK-74 ingeniously mounted on it, and this AK-74 is now flying here, a flying assault rifle, really targeting the Russian troops approaching the city. We see that by this small lake on the right side. It's just 2 kilometers away from the city, which is hunting down these troops. Yes, it's all still completely in the testing phase, of course. We're now starting to see a little bit that this rifle always tilts to the left because it was mounted in a somewhat angled manner on the drone. We might see it a bit from the running motion that... Yes, exactly. This part that actually points down now points to the right, and accordingly the weapon pulls to the left with each shot. That means there's still a lot to be done to stabilize this. Nonetheless, we see in the end that the drone managed to not only go hunting here, but also to return safely. And as we observe here, it seems that the Russians retaliated and managed to hit this AK-74 here with a bullet, which could very well mean it's no longer operational. It's hard to say for sure, but this situation clearly demonstrates to us that the drone not only survived the challenge, but also managed to make its way back safely with the rifle in tow. And the whole thing, of course, what might have been just a few months ago. Science fiction, a flying machine gun hunting soldiers, but that is the reality, which we are now, without a doubt, having to actively contend with in the Ukraine. Furthermore, in regards to the topic of drones, there is another additional video we definitely plan to watch. It was released by a Ukrainian activist known by the name Stanenko. He shows again what he is proud of, likely within the past 6 months during the time he managed these drone activists we see here, they published in Ukraine. To reprogram quadcopters so that they don't target ground targets but instead target air targets, namely Russian surveillance drones, and that he succeeded to bring down 400 of them from the sky within 6 months. And here we can see exactly how that happens. In the first case, it's quite an intriguing scene that you rarely come across, where you don't just witness it solely from the perspective of the drone that's attacking. The film concludes, and we must rely on the notion that the Russian drone was shot down, rammed, or something similar occurred. But we see here 2 drones which are following the Russian drone, and one is recording as the other attacks. And that's quite interesting because we'll see now what it actually looks like. Here, so right here, you can pause for a brief moment at the correct spot, and then here on the right we spot it, a tiny quadcopter, which is quite characteristic of these types of drones, as we can clearly see with these 4 rotors here. We can see below the payload, which is the explosive charge, and we can observe on top the battery, which is securely fixed there. And the entire system is presently being meticulously integrated into this Sala drone, which is a part of the Russian military's arsenal. We're now seeing the drone's approach from its perspective. And now here's the special part. We can focus for a moment. We clearly see the quadcopter at impact. The explosion is evident and shows how both drones precisely go down. We truly don't have to imagine this scenario ourselves. We simply need to envision it. Imagine 400 times. Here we see all the approaches that have been made there in the last 6 months. And the Ukrainian activist who equips very, very many units of the Ukrainian army with these drones has created a compilation, a summary of it again, to prove that indeed many hundreds of Russian kamikaze drones have been successfully intercepted. And in certain drones within specific areas, this has resulted in absolutely no Russian drones being visible in the sky whatsoever, for example near Kharkiv. North of it in Vovchansk, there are supposedly days or even weeks where not a single Russian surveillance drone is in the sky anymore. One must also say that the Russians pay less attention to this, but they need to keep their surveillance drones that are still there. Which we can also see them flying here at relatively high altitudes up to 5 kilometers, and they can also fly relatively far. We're talking about up to 200 kilometers for the total flight path. They absolutely need to focus and concentrate on the specific areas where they plan to advance. It's not Vovchansk or north of Kharkiv at the moment, but rather different areas. And we see this is something the Ukrainians consider as a success for themselves, saying yes, we were able to bring down 400 of them from the sky. Russia evidently has to reallocate its remaining forces, which will naturally still be in the order of a few hundred at the very least, toward other strategically important areas and regions. As I mentioned earlier, this is once more the summary of the past months, a video where if we observe closely, each instance takes approximately 2 seconds per crash or shoot down or per ram attack. Then you can really see here how many hundred drones the Russians have lost with this very new and innovative technology, and I personally don't know of any other country in the world that is capable of taking down surveillance drones from hostile states with small quadcopters. So much for the topic of drones. We want to go back to Wuhledar at the end. Wuhledar, a Ukrainian city that was captured by the Russian army about 6 weeks ago. Here we have some fresh recordings that vividly illustrate to us what the current reality in this area looks like, showing us exactly how Wuhledar appears at this point following its liberation. We are aware that about 20 to 50 Ukrainian civilians had been waiting here for the Russian forces, and they felt somewhat pleased with the arrival when the army finally showed up. we can clearly observe that what used to be a town of 10,000 inhabitants can now only provide a living for a maximum of 50 people at most, due to the fact that everything was thoroughly wrecked during almost 3 years of extreme Russian attacks on the city and Ukrainian defense. And the whole thing shows us once again what it means when Russia liberates a city in Ukraine, that this city afterwards is simply no longer viable, and also depending on the respective situation. If it happens quickly, sometimes 10% of the people stick around. But if this struggle drags on for months or years, then only 1% of the people remain. And in this case, it's exactly like that. So we see Volodar there, another new Russian city, in quotation marks, of course, in Ukraine. And we see how bleak and completely devastated the situation is there.